The honourable member for Churchill, Kiwatanuk Aski.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to rise in this House to revisit a question I asked a few months ago about a tragic situation that at the time was unfolding in our riding, and that of the suicide crisis in Pimicikamak Cree Nation, otherwise known as Cross Lake in northern Manitoba. Over the course of a few weeks at the end of 2015 and then in early 2016, 6 people took their lives in Cross Lake. And there were more than 100 suicide attempts that took place in the last number of weeks as well. As I pointed out in this House, Mr. Speaker, this did not just happen. The epidemic has everything to do with our history of colonialism, of racist policies, including the sustained underfunding of First Nations. And the results are truly horrifying. Half of First Nations children in Canada live in poverty. In Manitoba, 62% of Indigenous children live below the poverty line. And what do those conditions of poverty look like? Almost 1/3 of Manitoba First Nations live in reserve homes in need of major repair, the second highest percentage in the country. In terms of health, we know that residents have a higher mortality, a higher incidence and prevalence of diabetes, and we know, of course, that suicide rates on First Nations are double those of other communities. When it comes to education, we know that the debilitating 2% cap imposed by the Liberal government in the 90s has meant an underfunding of education, including underfunding of infrastructure like schools, including the lack of funds for sponsorship for post-secondary education. And of course, this has contributed to the educational outcomes of young people growing up on First Nations. We also know that the underfunding has resulted in the lack of recreation services that we would take for granted in non-First Nations communities, access to recreation centres, access to hockey rinks, access to a simple drop-in centre and some basic programming so that young people have somewhere healthy where they can go and be with each other. Mr. Speaker, I want to echo in this chamber once again the words of 17-year-old Amber Muskego from Cross Lake, who had said during the suicide crisis that there is nothing for young people to do in her community. As I pointed out, this is the face of crushing poverty and growing inequality in Canada. That is why First Nations, such as Pimicikamak Cree Nation, and I would say the other 40 First Nations that I have the honour of representing in northern Manitoba, are asking for support in terms of education, recreation, and jobs, so that young people, like the young people in Cross Lake and in other First Nations, don't have to reach that point of hopelessness that we hope that no youth will reach. And the question really here is, will the government listen to Amber and step up to support young people in Pimicikamak Cree Nation and First Nations across the country? I want to particularly point to the fact that in this last budget, the government did not fulfill its original commitment to to challenging the education underfunding. They also did not follow the Human Rights Tribunal directive to adequately fund child welfare services on First Nations. We know that there was no commitment made in the budget to Jordan's Principle, which has everything to do with ensuring that young people on First Nations have equitable access to health services. And sadly, Mr. Speaker, the details are still scant when it comes to addressing the underfunding of infrastructure in First Nations. We know that the housing monies are inadequate given the needs in communities, and we also know that there's a reference to social infrastructure, including recreation. And while that's an encouraging commitment, we have yet to see how, in fact, that fund will be rolled out. So the question, Mr. Speaker, is, so that we don't lose any lives like the lives that have been lost in Cross Lake, what is this government truly prepared to do to make a tangible difference in the lives of young people in Cross Lake and in First Nations across our country?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I wish to thank my colleague, the member for Churchill, Kiwatanuk Aski, for her question. And Mr. Speaker, I also want to thank the member for her advocacy and collaboration around these particular efforts. I know that she is very sincere in the work that she does. I know that because we have crossed paths and we deal with many similar issues as it relates to First Nations Inuit communities across Canada. Mr. Speaker, my heart goes out to the families and communities that have lost loved ones to suicide. I know the great personal sacrifice that many communities endure, and, Mr. Speaker, what many families endure. Suicide has touched many of us in this House personally and have extracted a very heavy toll on many of our families and the communities that we represent. We want to join the community in their grief and share with them our deepest condolences. I know that currently the government is working with Indigenous communities and leadership to provide supports for those that are grieving. Mr. Speaker, suicidal behavior is a risk at any age, is most often the tragic consequence of a complex array of factors that, when taken together, can weaken even the strongest and even the healthiest person, as I have personally witnessed, Mr. Speaker. Mental health issues such as depression, substance abuse, social and family factors, bullying or relationship issues, a lack of income, lack of housing and proper social supports, all of these things play a role in contributing to a decline in mental health. Excuse me. And they are vital to a sense of hope, to wanting to go on, and to seeing oneself contributing in society. Suicide rates among First Nations and Inuit youth are among the highest in Canada. Mr. Speaker, we are committed to taking action and have been taking action in the few months that we have formed government to prevent further deaths in communities like Pimicikamak, Mr. Speaker, and other Indigenous communities across Canada. It is vital to Canadians' shared success that we work collaboratively on a nation-to-nation basis to ensure better social and economic outcomes for Indigenous people. We believe that more must be done as a vital element of reconciliation, and I share that with the member. In addition, the Minister will work with the Minister of Families and Child and Social Development to launch consultations with provinces and territories and Indigenous peoples on a national early learning and childcare framework as a first step towards delivering affordable, high-quality, flexible, and fully inclusive childcare. A key component of combating this ongoing tragedy is working in partnership with Indigenous communities to promote and, in fact, ensure that people have a secure personal cultural identity. And we have invested in significant investments towards health research to ensure that we can provide for proper healthy promotion, prevention, and resilience. In addition, Mr. Speaker, we are committed to implementing Jordan's Principle. We have ensured that there are investments across the board of government to meet that challenge and the goal that we have established. We are already negotiating with provinces and territories around a new health accord, which will include investments in mental health. In addition, Mr. Speaker, we have invested more than $8.4 billion over the next 5 years to meet many of the issues around poverty that exist in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, ensuring that we are investing in housing, in recreation, in shelters, and in infrastructure that is needed in many of these communities. We are looking at how the cost of living is impacting people. We're looking at how the lack of programs and investment over the last decades is impacting people. So, Mr. Speaker, we are committed to ensuring that change and progress happens. The cost of doing nothing remains too high, and we are all connected to this issue and connected to make progress for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in the country.
Member for Churchill, Kiiwetinoong Aski.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague, and I certainly recognize her commitment to this issue as well. And while I'm heartened to hear about the government's commitments, certainly as were outlined in the budget, what concerns me is truly the lack of action. And you know, I've been in touch with a number of communities in our north. I've been visiting communities since the budget was tabled, and people don't know how the commitments in the budget are actually going to roll out. Nobody nobody has contacted them in terms of addressing the underfunding of education, in terms of housing, in terms of recreation. And Mr. Speaker, that's simply not okay, because we know, whether it's Amber Muskego, whether it's young people across the country, they've said that action is really what's going to make the difference here. And I also want to outline, and many members on the other side are very proud to talk about their commitment to reconciliation. Reconciliation requires action. And Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of the position that we have taken in the NDP to hold the government to account, but to also make it very clear that in order to work with First Nations to prevent suicide, we're going to need to see real action from this government as soon as possible. Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And there's so many things that I could address around this issue, but there's a couple that I do want to highlight, because we know and understand the problem that exists. And we are working, Mr. Speaker, with Indigenous governments across Canada to build a path forward, a path that will include reconciliation, but a path as well, Mr. Speaker, that lifts up our Indigenous communities and allows them to play a larger role in Canada. Mr. Speaker, the Minister will form a Voices of Indigenous Youth Council to facilitate the Minister's hearing directly from Indigenous youth across the country and what is needed in their communities. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, we realize and know the loss of life through suicide is tragic, especially amongst our youth. In addition to adequate health and mental health supports, we must ensure that people in the communities have hope. That's why our government is engaging on a nation-to-nation basis, Inuit to Crown basis, with Indigenous people. It begins with addressing the youth and what their issues are. It begins with addressing the well-being of all Indigenous people, and that means dealing with our child welfare system, our education system, our employment situation, and the infrastructure needs that many of these communities require. So I tell the member opposite, continue with her advocacy work as we will continue with ours, and in partnership, we will find a better path forward.